Feliz Nazca. Feliz Nazca. Feliz Nazca. No sé bien español. I wanna wish you a merry overview. I wanna wish you a merry dominions. I wanna wish you a merry Christmas from the bottom of my heart. Merry Christmas, everyone. Hello, and welcome to another Dominion 6 National Overview. In this one, we'll be going over Middle Age Nazca, the Kingdom of the Sun. Middle Age Nazca is a necrocracy, which means it is ruled by the dead. It was once a Kalian colony, but after the fall of the Raptors and the disappearance of the Eagle Kings, they lost contact. Now, they do their own thing. And that thing is wrapping up their dead and turning them into mummies. It started with their great kings and queens, but now it goes to all members of their priests and priestesses. For the nation of Nazca, they have access to both flying and cold resistance units, and they prefer a cold scale of 1. They have access to flying units, they have lots of recruits which are free, and by recruits we mean slaves. They also have access to reanimator priests that can reanimate the dead, as well as their sacred sun guards and Condor warriors. For magic, they have access to a lot of magical paths, but usually at a low level. This can obviously be boosted up through battle boosters or through forging boosters. As for priests, they have access to Holy Threes, and their undead priests can also reanimate the dead, giving them access to undead chaff. For their scales and blesses, they have an order limit of +1, a cold limit of +1, and a death limit of +1. Also, when it comes to forts, they can only build primitive forts, which reduces their wall integrity and makes it easier to be taken down, unless you go for a certain tactic, which we'll go over in a second. For the races of Nazca, all 3 of these races have access to cold resistance, as well as mountain survival, but are split into 3 main categories. The Kalians are the descendants of Kalum that have come over to create the colony that has now become Nazca. They are size 4, like the previous Kalians in early age Kalum. They can fly, but they also use less supplies than normal size 4 units, only taking the equivalent of size 3s. Some of the leaders of Nazca will be turned into mummies upon death, which makes them become undead. They turn into innate spellcasters if they were spellcasters in life, and if they have access to any holy levels, they also become reanimator priests. Nazca also has access to undisciplined humans at size 3. These humans are also available for recruitment in any mountain and highland province. So, let's move on to your recruitable troops. Middle Age Nazca has a good selection of flying troops as well as some additional undisciplined humans. The flyers give you good tactical flexibility for things such as raiding as well as attacking rear. You unfortunately don't have any naturally stealthy flyers though outside of summons. Your non-flying humans can provide you a cheapish chaff line, but you also have access to slaves and undead that can also fulfill that role. Bear in mind as well that humans cannot fly, and they will slow down any armies of flyers that you have. Your troops are okay, but they're definitely not the best of the age by far, but they're fairly cheap and not that resource intensive. The main downside to most of your troops is their low protection, which means that they're going to take attrition whenever you're expanding or fighting enemy forces, so you have to make sure that you have the ability to reinforce as your campaigns go on. Additionally, the fact that your flyers are size 4 means they have lower attack density, and as well you may have some issues with encumbrance in longer fights. Let's move on to your slave, the Hatun Runa. The Hatun Runa is a low upkeep slave, but they have pretty poor stats, only attack skill of 8, they have a mace, which means they don't have any way of having a charge strike. Their morale is pretty bad, so they will run away, and unfortunately as a nation you are lacking in anybody who has a taskmaster ability, so you can't really improve this morale outside of some buffing spells. The one thing the Hatun Runa does really well is they make a very good castle defender. Because of your primitive forts, you have lower wall integrity than other forts of the age, but these guys are able to defend castles very well, in combination with their ability to fly and their low upkeep. These guys can either be recruited normally, or they can also be levied by normal Malki. Bear in mind that when you are levying slaves, it will increase the unrest in the province, so try not to do it in your capital if you have the option. The main use for these troops will be for either sieging down enemy forts, protecting your own, or just using them for bodies. Just don't expect that much from them, they'll probably just die in droves. Next up, we have the 4 varieties of your human warrior. You have 2 of them with spears, one with a shield, one without, one of them with a mace and a sling, and the other one with a mace and a javelin, and slightly heavier armour. Most of your humans only cost 3 resources, but 7 resources for your elite, better armoured human warrior with the mace. While it is 1 gold more expensive than the others, getting shields with these guys will massively improve their survivability, increasing their defense skill, giving them better protection against arrows, and also giving them a better chance of living. As a whole, these troops don't have very good protection. Even your more elite version doesn't have that great protection either. These guys are also undisciplined. You're going to be using them as chaff. They're going to just be there to tar pit your enemy as best as you can, so don't really expect that much of them. One thing you can do with your slingers is you can use things like flaming arrows and wind guide with your slings, and that can actually be surprisingly effective. However, because they're undisciplined and you have no tight rain ability, that is slightly annoying. You cannot script them, and you're forced to have them in skirmish formation. If you want to, you can also recruit the javelins for a bit of extra punch, and that is especially useful if you're going up against something like a giant. As mentioned previously, you can also foreign recruit these human warriors in any mountains or highlands. For your next Kalian troop, you have the Oak Runa Spearmen. These guys are flying lancers, which means they get an additional charge strike on the first strike. These guys will be the mainstay of your armies, to be perfectly honest. These are the guys that actually are able to do some damage with their lance. They've got okay protection, not great, more sliding towards terrible, but that doesn't matter if your enemy is dead. You really want to be focusing on alpha strikes with these guys. You want to have them on attack rear or attack archers, because you don't really want them fighting actual enemy troops if possible. They will die in prolonged combat, their stats just aren't quite good enough. Fortunately, with their shield, they do actually have slightly good defense skill, which in combined with their reinforced armor means they're more likely to survive so long as you can keep getting that parrying. Out of all of your normal troops, these are probably the best and the one that you'll be recruiting the most of, so use them as raiders as well as in your main armies in order to do a little bit of damage. Next up, we have the Oak Runa Macemen. This is a more specialised troop in my mind than your spears. They don't have a charge bonus, which means generally they're worse than lances. You're unlikely to kill something in 1 mace strike, so you probably want to stick to the lancers. They do, however, have their positives. They are useful versus foes with resistances, specifically things like slash or pierce resistance, so if you know you're coming up against a monolith, boost these guys' strength up and just see what they can do in order to get around that. They do decent damage with their mace, which is also very nice if you know you're going up against tankier sacreds. And they can also be quite good against size 3s or lower. And that's because they are larger than size 3s, which means they're more likely to hit them on the head, so the mace will then do its extra damage. Next up, we have the Okak Runa Axemen, which is another specialised pick for you to choose for. These guys are useful because they actually have a higher attack skill than any of your other recruitable troops outside your sacreds with their bronze hatchet, while still dealing decent damage. This is useful against foes with good defense, things like your elves, but you can also use things like your slings or your javelins against them as well. They don't rely on their first strike to do damage, so it does mean that they stay better than the spearmen, much like your macemen, but they'll will need some defensive buffs and probably some offensive buffs as well if you actually really want to get any use out of these guys. Finally, for your normal troops, we have the Okak Runa Archer. These guys are precision 11 archers, which is pretty good. It means they're more accurate than your normal archers, but they are size 4, which makes them not as great for taking buffs. Additionally, they only have 8 protection for archer duels, and because they're not using a sling, they don't have any shields to help protect them from arrows, which does mean that you will take quite a bit of attrition if you sit there in archer duels. They can make nice bodyguards for your commanders. They still shoot while bodyguarding, and it means that while your mages are sitting there casting their spells or doing whatever they're doing, there's somebody else that can potentially take an arrow for them. They're also quite good for having towards the back of your army, as they'll give other attack rear options for the enemy, not going for your mages, but you probably don't want these guys in combat if you can help it. With some supporting buffs, these guys are decent enough archers. If you give them flaming arrows, a wind guide, if you give them a little bit of a strength buff, they can actually do quite a lot of work, especially if you also then help the precision. They're also very good for supporting your skeletons that you'll be reanimating, because with their short bows they do pierce damage, which obviously your skeletons are resistant to, so it means that you can fire into combat. You don't really have to worry so much about any losses that you're taking. Now onto your first sacred. We have the Condor Warrior, which is a cap-only sacred with a lance. These guys thankfully have better stats than your spearmen, and they have the price tag to go with it. These guys are immune to storm, so they can fly on through, and they can obviously be blessed with whatever bless that you have. Overall, with their stats, they're slightly lackluster as sacreds, but if you have a good enough bless, it can help push them through and make them useful. If you're not recruiting any other sacreds, you probably still want to get a couple of these guys because they do have better stats and they do more damage than your normal troops, and they're not that much more expensive. They're obviously more expensive, but not that much more. Use them as more of an elite force. Storm immunity is really nice as a backup strat, but you don't rely on it quite as much as you do, say, with early age Calum. They really enjoy buffs to improve their staying power, or things like strength buffs in order to improve their alpha strike, so if you can do something like boost up these guys' natural protection, they'll stay in the battle for a lot longer. Additionally, if you give them something like a blood surge and you give them a bunch of strength buffs, they'll probably take out the enemy before too long anyway. Finally, for your sacreds, we have the Sun Guard, which is a capital-only bodyguard flyer. Slightly more expensive than the Condor Warrior, but they do come with an inbuilt magic weapon, which also does bonus damage versus the undead, which is quite nice because you will potentially be going up against armor. They have good stats and they actually have decent protection, the highest protection that you have out of all of your troops. They are, however, too expensive to be any kind of workhorse, and obviously sacred as well, although they can be more useful if you do have a very expensive bless. Survivability buffs do wonders for them if you've got Body Ethereal, Mist Form, Twist Fate, anything like that. That will really help them out. Unlike your Condors, they don't have Storm immunity, so they will not be useful for that. And also, they have a lower map move than most of your other flyers, so they will slow down your armies. Something to consider before picking them up. So that was your troops. What can we take away from this? Well, you have access to a lot of flying troops, as it makes you a good nation to raid and attack rear. Unfortunately, you have no national stealthy commanders, however, which is a little bit of a shame, but you could potentially build a bless for that. You have an okay, but not that great chaff front line in terms of your humans. Your flyers are pretty much too flimsy and expensive to hold anything without losses, especially your slaves, but you can also reanimate skeletons with your mages in order to supplement those forces. More on that later. You have okay sacreds, especially the summons, which again we'll go into after the mages. And your sacreds are better than your normal troops, but they're nothing really to write home about unless you go for a very expensive bless. To be quite honest, your mainstay tactic is going to be going for your spearmen and having massed lance charges, attacking your enemy's archers, attacking their rear line, in an attempt to do a massive shock damage to them and get the enemy army to rout. However, you do have access to some specialised troops for dealing with specific targets if you've done your scouting. You have some range play when it comes to bows and slings, but it's not that great in the mid-age where there's better armour and you only have access to short bows. But with some buffs, they can do some work. Let's move on to your commanders. With Middle Age Nazca, you have a good selection of flying commanders, as well as walking mummies and a walking human. Speaking of your human, he's a cheap foreign recruit commander, useful for ferrying around your walking human hordes. You have access to a lot of good mages, some of which have wide and very useful paths, as well as your mummies, useful for specific roles. We'll go more into that when we go into each mummy, but bear in mind that these mummies are much more expensive in upkeep than usual commanders. So, if you have too many of them, upkeep might become a little bit of an issue. You have access to reanimators for your skeleton chaff and sacreds with your holy threes. However, your primitive forts only allow one mage recruitment per turn per fort, so you might struggle to get the mage economy for research that other nations might have. For your first basic commander, we have Ruan Chua, who is a very good flying scout. They're very mobile, with a high map move, and pretty decent stealth as well. Very good for getting information early, and they only cost 1 commander point to recruit, so you can get a few of these guys out in every fort. Useful so you know what you're going to be fighting, and where you can expand to with your high map move. Definitely get these guys more than independent scouts. Moving on to your human commander, you have the Kuraka, who are a pretty cheapish, okay leader. They're good as a troop carrier for your walking troops, but they miss out a little bit for your flying troops just because they do have a lower map move. Their foreign recruit in both highlands and mountains saves fort turns on them, which does make them better than indie commanders because they can lead a couple more men. Use them to ferry around your troops, but you probably won't be relying on that much. Next up we have the Apu, which is an okay flying leader. They're good for leading raiding parties around with your flyers, and they're not actually that expensive for a flying commander. Honestly, for these guys though, you usually have 2 roles to them. One is a troop farrier for flying troops, or using them as a cheap way to come back as a Malki. On death, these guys come back as a Malki, as one of your undead mummies. This is quite useful, as this will save you gold over actually just recruiting a Malki straight up. If you're struggling to figure out where to send them, just throw these guys into indies. Maybe they'll kill 1 or 2 guys, and then they'll come back as your Malki, ready to raise up some slaves for you. For a slightly better commander, we have the Apu Coupe, which is a better leader than the Apu. They can lead more troops, and they have a slight morale boost from the fact that they're good leaders. They are a bit more expensive though when it comes for gold. They have similar jobs to the Apus, but they can actually be made into a pretty decent backup leader with a couple of magical items. On death, again, these guys come back as a Malki. It's nice for flexibility, but if you want to just go for Malki though, go with the Apus, it's cheaper and you'll end up with the same end product. Finally, for your basic commanders, we have the Malki, who is a good leader, but of the undead variety, not of the living. Useful for moving around your undead hordes when you get them. They're also slavers of the Hatun Rata, which means that they can levy slaves in order to recruit some of these slaves free of charge. However, this does cause unrest, so it does mean that you're going to be losing out on some income. Use these guys to recruit the slaves that you need in order to keep your forts up and keep your siege defense nice and high, so your opponent has to sit there for multiple turns, sieging down your castles, and you can raid them to your heart's content. These guys are sacred, but they cannot bless themselves, and they don't have any magical paths in which to help out the battlefield. They're quite expensive to recruit, and they do have quite a high upkeep, so if you have the option, just kill off a couple of Apus if you need them, rather than spending the money in order to recruit them straight up. All Malki will have 4 bearers that carry them around and into combat. These bearers are effectively their mount, and you'll get them back if they die, so you don't need to worry about them losing all their bearers and then you losing your Malki. Just don't expect the bearers to do very much in combat, they have very poor stats. We'll probably not really mention them again, but you know, they can maybe take a hit for your Malki instead of them, so in that way, they're actually kind of nice. All of your mummies have weakness to fire, so be careful when you're going up against fire evocations or if you're going into hot provinces. And like most undead, you got to be careful of things like banishments and of things like withering bones. Moving on to your mages, the first one we have is the Akla. The Aklas are decent researchers, they have access to Fire 1 and Air 1, as well as Holy 1, and they're sacred, so they're not too expensive. They haven't got the best paths for combat. I mean, they're alright, but they're only level 1, they can't boost themselves up. They can boost themselves up with gems though, so if you give them some gems, you can boost your fire up to 2 for combat. Fire in a jar is great on them for this reason. Or, if you want to, you can just give them a slave matrix, so they can be useful in your communions. These guys are best to support you via their research, but they are also your cheapest unit that is able to bless. So if you're wanting to go out with a couple of sacreds in order to do an expansion party, or some flying raiding, these guys can at least bless them. On death, they'll come back as a Malki priestess, which you can use for reanimation of undead chaff. Speaking of which, we have your Malki priestess, a Fire 1, Air 1 and Holy 1 undead mage. These guys are recruitable in forts or are made on an Akla's death, where they are mummified to become a Malki priestess. They have the same paths as the Alka when they die, but it doesn't really make a difference because they haven't got any randoms anyway. These guys are innate spellcasters, so they're able to cast long spells quicker than other people would be able to, and they've also got some decent resists being undead, with the exception of their fire resistance as we mentioned previously. They do have low paths, so you do need to boost them up in fire in order to make them more useful, which can be a little bit annoying given the fact that they have a crown slot on their head, but they do have 4 miscellaneous slots, so they can hold a fire in a jar, they can hold a fire death skull for another booster once you get up to construction level. That can get them up fire a lot, and they can just absolutely go to town with things like falling fires. Do keep in mind as well that they are undead, which means they have all the negatives that come with that. A little bit of a shame, but it's the truth. These undead girls are mostly useful for reanimating more chaff undead. They're only Holy 1, so they're not the best at it, but they're fairly cheap in comparison to the other Malki. Just because they're cheaper than other Malki doesn't mean they don't have high upkeep though, so be careful that you only have these guys when you really need them. Fortunately, they are also fortune tellers, so they will help stop bad events in your forts while they're doing their job of summoning more undead chaff. If you need to as well, they also are pretty good undead leaders. They're able to lead more troops than just a regular Malki, and they can also bless up your sacreds as well, so keep that in mind if you want to use them. Next up for your mages, we have the Hurin Priest, an Earth 1, Death 2, Holy 2 mage, with a potential chance for either an Air, Earth, or Astral random path at 100%. These guys are probably going to be your main battle mage. Death 2 from the get-go is very nice. That instantly puts you into summon skeleton territory in order to do some nice supporting, and your randoms are also good for the various combat paths. Air starts to unlock things like Winds of Death later on. Earth levels means you can then start going up Earth as well. And if you get an astral path, perfect. That means you can go straight into communion, either as a master or a slave. You probably want them more as masters and forging up crystal matrices for your communion slaves, or praying that you get some sort of indie who is also an astral mage. You can also bless troops, which does make them okay as a supporting force for your sacreds, and they're probably going to be the guys that are going to be making up your earth boots to get your hammers, as well as things like your skull staffs. You can use them also to boost up the morale of your troops if you want, with some sermons of courage, which might help some of them stay, but you've got pretty low morale anyway, so, I mean, it's up to you. On death, these guys are mummified to a Malquis priest, who will share the same paths as the Huron. Up next we have the Malquis priest, which are made either from your dead Huron priests, or they can be recruited at forts for quite a hefty 500 gold. And for that you get a Earth 1, Death 2 caster, with Holy 2, and 100% chance for +1 in Air, Earth, or Astral. Or, if they were made from a dead Huron priest, they'll get their paths instead. Much like other Malquis, they are weak to fire, but they have resistance to poison, they're undead, they have cold resistance, and they are also fortune tellers. The Malquis priest is actually an even better reanimator than the priestess, not only because they're a Holy 2, but also they have better priest and death reanimation. So if you want to use these guys for rituals, they'll be the ones to use it for. They are more expensive in upkeep in comparison to the Malquis priestess though, so if you're just going to be using them to get low level chaff, you might be better off with the Malquis priestess, just so you have more people able to bless or cast other spells. The main benefit of the Malquis priest in comparison to the Huron is they are far scarier in combat, especially with their innate caster. They can cast spells that would usually take a long time in order to cast in the first turn, which makes them very scary to go up against. Having your air randoms, if you're able to boost them up in death enough, in order to cast things like Winds of Death repeatedly, over and over and over again, is pretty scary. Although you might struggle to get the pass with these guys and have to rely more on your cap-only Malquis. One thing to keep in mind with these guys as well is they're not as good communion masters as your Huron priests, and that's because your slaves will take more fatigue. Which is what happens when an innate spellcaster becomes a communion master. Bear in mind that your innate spellcasters also cannot become communion slaves, so you're a little bit more limited with these guys when it comes to communions than their Huron priest counterparts. Moving on to your capital-only mages, the first one we have is the Inca, a slow-to-recruit capital-only mage who has Earth 2, Fire 2, and Holy 3, with a 10% chance of +1 in either Fire, Air, or Astral. These guys are pretty good army leaders, although they can thug with some gear as they have some inbuilt awe, as well as some additional resistances. They actually make pretty effective fire casters with buffs. If you got something like Phoenix Power, or Crystal Shield, or Power of the Spheres to boost up their levels, they can actually cast some pretty high level, both fire and air spells. They are also your best leaders of mundane troops, so keep that in mind if you want to be using them for the largest troops amounts that you can, but honestly just kind of leave it to your more mundane guys. These guys are slow to recruit, so you're not going to have too many of them, and your capital's also going to be quite busy. If an Inca dies, then they will turn into a Royal Malquis. Now this Royal Malquis will take the Inca's pass, whatever ones it has, and if a Koya is available, the next unit we're going to talk about, it will also take her pass as well. If not, a commoner will be used instead, and you won't get the full Royal Malquis. Use these guys as army leaders or support your armies with big spells, things like Flaming Arrows, Wind Guide, or just fire evocations, and bear in mind that they're Holy 3 for divine blessings, as well as taking over thrones. Never underestimate the power of a flying Holy 3. Next up we have the Koya, another slow to recruit mage who is capital only, who comes with Earth 2, Astral 2, Death 2, and Holy 2, with a 30% chance of +1 in either Fire, Air, Earth, Astral, or Death. These ladies are very good mages, probably the best living one that you have. They have access to good base paths, especially for things like forging and doing some summons, and also If you manage to get lucky and get a random, it can also unlock some nice forging opportunities for you. You can reach very high paths for these girls in combat through use of communions, boosters, etc., which makes them very good for using powerful battlefield-wide spells, anti-magic, fields of the dead, and any of the spells that your randoms will let you unlock as well. Out of all the ladies, these are probably the ones you want to be using as your communion masters if you can. Try and keep your Malky out of your communions as much as possible. On death, these girls will all turn into Royal Malky, and this Royal Malky will only have their paths if you don't have a corresponding Inca. If there is a corresponding Inca, the Inca will be killed, and they'll both become a full Royal Malky. Use these ladies for their forging ability, for their ability to do summons, including your sacred summons, and also to turn into a Royal Malky with a little bit of less gold cost. Speaking of which, we have the creme de la creme of the Nazca Empire, the Royal Malky. A good undead leader with Fire 2, Air 2, Earth 2, Astral 2, Death 2, and Holy 3, with a 10% chance of +1 in Fire, Air, Earth, Astral, or Death. These guys are undead with all the problems that comes with it, as with the other Malky. They have weakness to fire, but you can buff that up through their paths. And they're very good for reanimating your sacred with their Holy level 3. These guys are recruitable from your capital, and they only cost 2 commander points each, but that does come with a price tag of 1,200 gold. Given, however, in order to make a full one, you need to recruit both an Inca and a Koya. Both of them are slow to recruit. That's going to take you 4 turns, and then one of them is going to have to die. Does mean that it's far more turn efficient in order to recruit these guys later on when you have the cash for it. These guys have incredibly high upkeep, and they have the bling to go with it. But the fact that they're innate spellcasters 2s means they can cast spells amazingly. They can throw out longer casting spells very quickly. They can cast 2 spells a turn. The only thing that limits them is their paths. However, in battle, you're able to get that up with things like Power of the Spheres into other boosting things like Phoenix Power or Earth Power. And this lets them do a lot of good evocation spells or long casting spells from here. One thing to be careful of is their Astral. It's not the highest, so they might get magic dueled into death. Just something to keep in mind. Moving on to your foreign recruit mages. First of all, we have the Paco of the Earth Mother. An Earth 1, Nature 1 mage who is a heretic and a not that great researcher, but you can recruit them in a mountain or highland. Their paths are not the best. They do get you into nature, which is nice. Also gives you another Earth caster for some low level Earth magic. And they're quite useful if you're able to empower them up into nature or earth. Worst comes to worst, one of the Sight Searcher isn't going to hurt that much. They are fortune tellers, so they do stop bad events in the province that they are in. However, they are also a heretic, so they will lower your dominion, which can actually work in your favour depending on your dominion. They're also disease healer, so good with some mages. Because they have access to nature, they are quite nice for doing some forging with the Earth-Nature cross path, and also for casting Beast Fury on your animal sacreds. More on that in a little bit. Finally, for your foreign mages, we have the Paco of the Mountain Spirits, an Air 1, Nature 1 mage who's very similar to the Earth Mother. Unfortunately, I do think they have slightly weaker paths in my opinion. Air 1 isn't the best path for combat, Nature 1 isn't the best combat path either. You can boost them up with some gems in order to do some stuff, but you're not really going to be using these guys thugging, so it's not really that worth it. Still, they are foreign recruit in both highland and mountainous regions, but they're not very good researchers. And worst comes to worst, they still give you a little bit of access to nature. Unlike the previous mage as well, they've got slightly better stats for combat, but again, you don't really want to be using these guys in combat. You can use their supply bonus to be more useful in sieges, but they're more useful for their nature access and their air access. They're still also heretics, so you got to keep that in mind. And they bring her fortune for causing good events. You want to use these guys, as well as the other mothers, as their heretic ability if you have terrible scales, and you want your forts to have at least neutral scales instead. They're also quite useful for healing up some of your mages if you have older mages that you're recruiting, say indie sages for example, to help with your research. These guys are really good for making sure that they're not getting diseased and dying while they're researching for you. So what can we take away from your mages? Well, you have a lot of paths, but usually at quite low level. Around level 2 for most of your paths, barring some randoms for some of your mages. An exception can be made with your nature mages, which only have level 1, but you can get higher up with some empowerment. So they can then start crafting some nature boosters so you can start doing some summons to help you get further up into that. The main way that you can make your mages better is by either forging boosters or casting communions or path boosting spells in battle. And this will give you access to big battle magic when you need it. Is be careful about using your mummies as communion masters, as they're innate spellcasters, and they'll massively increase the fatigue your communion slaves will take whenever they cast a spell. For your undead priests, you have good reanimators for your undead hordes, and for your sacreds, for your holy threes, which is good for saving up some of your gems. Your Malkays cost a lot, both when they're recruited and also in their upkeep, so just be a little bit wary that your finances can take all of these undead mummies. You can bankrupt yourself after a big battle, after suddenly all of your mages turn into undead mummies who require quite a large stipend. Your foreign recruit mages are niche, but they can be quite nice with Condors with their nature levels, so do keep that in mind. Let's move on to your national summons. The first national summon that Nazca has access to is the Condor, which they get a Conjuration 3 requiring Air 2 and 8 Air Gems. For that you get 10 Condors with an additional 1 summoned for every extra level in Air. These guys are very stealthy, having a massive 140 stealth rating, and they also are disciplined animals that are able to fight for you. They absolutely tear through lightly armored troops because they have 3 attacks, which is amazing. And they're also, because they're flyers, fantastic siegers and patrollers, but they also get a patrol bonus and a siege bonus on top of that. These guys, because of their 3 attacks, take a bless very, very well. And they actually have decent stats, better than your normal troops, and kind of on par with your Condor warriors. Only thing to worry about is their protection. They don't take a hit that well, and they don't have that much hit points. You want to try and go for either a bless that will help them kill things in combat, or a more defensive bless so they can tank up a little bit more damage. It used to be in previous versions of the minions that you would make an Air 10 tender and then just summon as many Condors as you could as part of winning your first war. And that is still pretty good. Condors are good, but with more troops around, they don't take damage very well. That strategy doesn't work quite as well as my mind. Still not bad, but you maybe don't want to go all in on your Condors. With the stealthy flying commanders, these guys would be really scary as raiders, which does make it so you might want to take an obfuscate bless if you're able to. Additionally, as I was saying with the foreign recruit nature mages, if you're able to cast Beast Fury with these Condors, improving their morale and their attack skill is really, really nice. For your next national summon, we have the Huaka, which you can summon at Conjuration 5 for an Astral 2 ritual requiring 12 Astral Pearls that summons 5 of your Huaka. These guys are pretty good sacreds. They've got storm immunity, they are magic beings, which does suck a little bit, it must be said, as they will be a little bit vulnerable because of that. But they can fly, they have resistances to cold, to lightning, to fire, and they also have an inbuilt aura of 2. On top of that, they've got high protection, they've got an inbuilt magic attack, and if you can give them a poison resist bless as well, it does make them quite resistant to most types of damage. Because they're better able to deal with chaff that they might be coming across, and potentially even other better sacreds. The good thing about the Huaka is they're not that expensive to summon. It is 12 gems for 5, but in terms of summonable sacreds, that's not too bad. They're a nice addition to your armies, and they're also pretty good use of your astral gems. If they were a bit more efficient, that'd be good, but they're still 2 gems per, which is a bit of a shame, at least until you get your national forging item. Finally, for your national summons, we have the Supaya, who are ethereal undead sacreds that you can summon at Conjuration 5 for Death 2, and they require 8 death gems for 5 Supayas. These are the undead ghosts of your Huakas, and they are ethereal undead sacreds, which is pretty nice. However, they do have spirit form, which isn't great. It does hurt your ability to buff them, but you know, beggars can't be choosers. They have inbuilt poison resistance, cold resistance, and they're also able to fly in storms. The best thing about these summons is they have a pretty decent summon ratio, especially if you also give the person who's summoning them the national forge item on top of that, which does make it so it's almost a 1-to-1 for gems to Supayas summoned. Because of the fact that they're ethereal, they're very good against mundane troops or anybody who's not using any kind of magical weapon, able to dodge the majority of their hits. And also, they're some of your only amphibious sacreds, so they go well with your undead armies for going and attacking under the water. As mentioned previously, the fact their spirit form does hurt buffs in that they can't get any protection, but taking something like a Stygian Flesh Bless will give them some invulnerability to mundane attacks, so do keep that in mind. You can also get Supayas from Holy 3 Reanimators, which with a good bless can get very scary if you also use them with your Conjuration Ritual. allowing you to get a lot of these guys, much more than any other sacred, with the exception of probably your Condors. Let's move on to your national heroes. The first national hero you have is the Apostate Seraph, Keshva, who is a Fire 1, Astral 2, Air 3, Water 2 mage, who is an adept researcher and is also sacred. This makes him a very nice researcher, means their upkeep isn't too high, and they're also the only person that has access to water, which is very nice for allowing you to get additional forging items. Specifically, if you can give him a fire booster, he then gets access to crafting a rune smasher in order to improve your mage's magical penetration. Very, very nice. Best use him as support mage. He doesn't have the HP or the inbuilt gear to really be that useful, and he also makes a really nice researcher, so you probably use him for that. Try keeping him away from battles as much as you can. You have other mages, they're able to do the job for you. Finally, for your last national hero, we have the Manco Oklo, the first couple, who are a Fire 2, Air 2, Earth 2, Astral 2, Death 4, Holy 3 mage, who is another one of your Malki. They're basically a souped up Royal Malki, and they are a very high death caster, the highest death that you have access to nationally outside of your Pretender. They are also an innate spellcaster 3, making them the best spellcaster you have access to, potentially on par with something like a Monolith for one of your Pretenders, and they're also very good for summoning additional death casters. They can magic phase easily with their Air 2, which means you can Cloud Trapeze in order to assist armies, and they make very effective reanimators as well. Due to their tags, you do have to be careful about anti-undead spells, but they are a little bit tankier with higher magic resist than your other Royal Malki, so they are a little bit better off against that. Best use this one as a reanimator and supporter in a fort, and if you really need them to help out in, say, like Desperate Defense or a castle or something like that, you can Cloud Trapeze to go support the armies, and then just absolutely get rid of the enemy with a bunch of spells. And you can also keep them safe with a specific tactic with Rings of Returning. Like all Malki, they have access to 2 head slots, but they're only crowns, as well as 4 miscellaneous slots, so do keep that in mind. Like the Royal Malki, they have access to 2 head slots because there's 2 of them, but they are crowns only, as well as 4 miscellaneous slots, so they can't hold any weapons unless you give them some copper arms, which we'll go over in the forging items section. As for your national sites, you have 2. You have the Palace of the Sun Kings, which allows you to recruit your Inca, your Koya, and your Sun Guard, and also gives you 1 fire gem, 1 air gem, and 1 astral pearl per turn. And for your second site, you have the Tomb of the Sun Kings, which allows you to recruit your Royal Malkis and your Condor Warriors, and it gives you 1 death gem and 1 earth gem per turn for 5 gems in total every turn, which is quite nice. Gives you a nice spread across all of your various paths. For the national spells of Middle Age Nazca, you have 2. The first one being Eyes of the Condor, which you get enchantment 2. It's an Air 2 ritual that costs 1 air gem, and it lets you effectively just scry on a province, as long as it's not a sea province. The enemy will not know that you've done this, but it just gives you another way of scrying on things. Quite useful if you need to get information about certain things. It's got a 4 province range. Can be nice if you also have any way of boosting rituals, say like a magical site, and it's quite a cheap one that you can use as well. Not the best, but certainly not the worst. For the last national spell, we have the Geoglyph spell, which comes at enchantment 5, which is an Astral 3 Earth 2 ritual requiring 18 gems, which enchants the local province for the current gem duration with the Geoglyph status. Has to be done by a flying commander, so it's going to be one of your Koyas with a booster probably, and it must be done in a waste province. And what this will do is it'll increase the magic scale by 2 within the province, while reducing the magic resistance for enemies in the province by 2, and also extending out the ritual range. A kind of niche spell, you're not really going to be casting this much, but if you have, say, a lab instant setup in a waste, you want to cast this in order to improve the magic scale within the territory so you can get a little bit more research out of it. Can be quite nice in that respect. Speaking of magic, what kind of magical research do you want to get as Middle Age Nazca? Well, as I've said previously, you have a wide path access, but not that deep. So getting access to boosters for rituals and forging is going to be very important. And in battle, getting booster spells can help you a lot to get to the higher levels to cast bigger and better spells. In that vein, Conjuration is really good for boosting spells and sacred summons. I actually think Conjuration 3 is a very important research goal for Middle Age Nazca. Gives you access to your Condors, a very good sacred that you can start to summon in very large numbers depending on your air mages, and also gives you access to battle path boosters, which will massively increase the killing power that your mages have, as well as their buffing ability. Speaking of killing power, Evocation can turn casting Malki into very scary casters. If you haven't seen something come along and cast 3 falling fires in a turn, ooh, that's scary. And they're going to keep on doing that over and over and over again. So yeah, it can get pretty scary pretty quickly. Thaumaturgy is also very useful for allowing your communions and also giving you deeper access to spells in battle as well as some nice buffing spells, which we'll go on in a little bit. Alteration is also good for getting defensive buffs for your thugs and also for your army. And construction allows for sturdier chaff to be summoned through rituals, and more importantly for forging your boosters and your various gear that you need to make your mages operate at their best. So what are your research goals as Middle Age Nazca? Well, I really like going for Power of the Spheres and Communions. I've kind of put them together because they both do the same thing. You get these in your Conjuration and your Thaumaturgy. Both of these spells are for boosting up your mages. Power of the Spheres will increase the path level of all of your mages' paths by 1. A fantastic spell given the amount of astral mages that you have. If you're wanting to cast this spell, you can also do it with your communions. So if you have your communion master cast this spell, it will also improve the path levels of all the slaves by 1. A great way in order to make your slaves take less fatigue throughout the communion. For Nazca, given your low path access, it's very important that you manage to boost yourself up appropriately. This is a great way of doing it. Communions can really help out your living masters get up. You can use matrices in order to get the slaves, or you can use indies if you manage to get an astral indie. Next up we have Earth Meld and Maw of the Earth in Alteration. Like Early Age Calum, these spells are great because a lot of your units are flying. The ones that aren't, your undead, your humans, you don't really care too much about. Although I would say maybe don't cast these spells quite as much when you have more of those troops in your army. If you're mostly using flyers, these are a great way to support them. Holding the enemy in place to reduce their defense means they're more likely to hit them and be able to deal with them in prolonged combat. Additionally, the damage that Maws of the Earth does is not that bad, especially against human nations, so keep that in mind. And because you're flying, you're not going to get hit by none of the damage, you're not going to get gripped at all. All great. In the same kind of vein, you can say the same thing about Earthquake. Again, like Early Age Calum, Earthquake is a great spell for you to cast. It's really, really nice with your flying troops. You can get a communion of your flying mages in order to cast this, or even more scarily, if you can boost up a Royal Malky up using Power of the Spheres and summon Earth Power to Earthquake level 4, and then get them to cast this multiple times per turn, that's scary. Only thing is with Earthquake is it will damage your Malky, so you probably want to get something like a personal Iron Skin on them, just so they take a little bit less damage. But once you get that, just spamming that is going to help. Do not use Earthquake if you're using a lot of undead, specifically your undead skeletons. You will wipe out your own skeletons, and you'll feel quite silly. I'm not speaking from personal experience here, honest. Next up, we have Lightning and Thunderstrike. You don't rely on these spells quite as much as, say, Early Age Calum. You've lost quite a bit of your air power. You're not slinging out storms as much as they are with, say, like their Eagle Kings, but you can boost up in order to cast things like Storm. You can make it so that you can get to Thunderstrike quite easily, and it does make quite a nice spell for casting with your Malky if you don't have anything else to cast. For another nice battlefield-wide spell, you do have Wind of Death. Wind of Death is a great spell to cast, especially on your Malky. It's a long cast time. You can cast out a whole bunch of these to do a lot of damage. Combine this with something like Returning or a Ring of Returning, and you can really annoy your enemies and just Wind of Death them down. Especially if you're Cloud Trapezing on them as well, which you should be doing. Next up we have Gift of the Fury and Beast Fury. Both of these are in Thaumaturgy. These are both great spells, both for your Condors and for your normal Sacreds and Troops. Giving people additional attack skill and additional morale really does increase their killing power quite a lot, and you want to make sure that you've got your troops killing on that first strike, especially with a lance. Giving +2 to your spearmen for their attack, for their first attack, does a lot for you for increasing their alpha strike potential. And on your Condors, it makes them just tear through normal troops very, very quickly. The downside to this is obviously because you're buffing your troops, you're holding them back for one turn more, which can be a double-edged sword depending on how much the enemy moves about from their formations as well. But if they're also on hold and they're buffing up, it's not that bad, to be quite honest. It's more of an issue if you really just need to engage the enemy if they have more powerful mages than you, for say. Next up is a little bit more of a weird spell. We have Magic Jewel, which you get an evocation, an astral spell. This is a spell you've got to be a bit more wary of than casting yourself, but there is a specific reason to cast it yourself. Your Royal Malky only have Astral level 2, which does make it so that, in comparison to other nations' Astral mages, they're actually pretty vulnerable to getting Magic Jeweled. For this, you're going to want to have additional astral mages with them that casting Magic Jewel or some other way, Soul Slay, Mind Burn, something like that, in order to try and cast and kill the enemy mages as quick as possible. If you're up against good astral mages, they can take out your very, very, very expensive Royal Malky pretty easily. So just keep that in mind. Additionally, for more of a thugging role, you have something like Soul Vortex and Alteration. You have access to a lot of good death casters. You can boost them up with Skull Staffs, and also using things like Power of the Spheres in order to increase their death level by 2 if they're astral mages. Using Soul Vortex to give them some way of regenerating their fatigue if the enemy comes in, or using it for turbo communions with your communion slaves, using some kind of regenerating, or using ablative fatigue, something like just having a bunch of chaff on bodyguard, for example, something like your slaves that are going to die, but you don't care because you're using them in order to get your mage's fatigue off for your communions. Something to keep in mind. Mist Form as well, and Alteration is another great way to make your thugs tankier in the early game. It really does quite a lot for reducing mundane troops' ability to deal with you. Obviously, as with all thugging, make sure that you have secondary defense, tertiary defense, and even further, just so your thugs have the ability to stay alive. Finally, as we were kind of going over when we were talking about the humans and their slings or your archers for your Kalians, Flaming Arrows and Wind Guide are something that you can cast fairly easily. You can cast it fairly quickly as well with some of your Malky, and that means that you can get these Flaming Arrows and the Wind Guide out pretty quick. While you don't have the most powerful range units in the game, if you can get something like Crossbowmen, if you can get something like Longbowmen, in addition to your national troops, this will give you some additional firepower that you can use against certain other nations that don't deal well against mass range firepower. So what are some good non-national summons for Middle Age Nazca? Well, kind of like Early Age Calum, you've got the Corpsemen. Corpsemen are a good non-national summon for you to use. It's an additional tanky frontliner. It's not quite as important as it was for Kalians, given the fact that you have Reanimator Priests, so you can actually reanimate quite a lot of undead. We're not talking Scalaria level, but a decent number of undead in order to help out as chaff, but Corpsemen can also take over and support you a little bit with that. You do also have access to Clockwork Soldiers and Horrors, again as another tankier frontline than your humans. Really good for protecting your mages, really good for guarding duty. Probably more the soldiers and the horrors. The horrors can actually do quite a lot of damage, and they do actually make a pretty killy front line. Something for the enemy to actually clash against while your hammer of your flying troops come down with their spears and they get a lance on them. As with all flying nations, Call of the Winds is a really nice one as well for you to use. Really nice just to be able to get that raiding hawks, even if they aren't the best. Really nice to get them for raiding. They're really good for patrolling afterwards. You've already got pretty good patrollers given the amount of flying troops that you have, but as you will probably be levying quite a few slaves, just having something else that's upkeep free to do that is quite nice to get. As for some death summons, Mound Fiends are a fantastic summon for you. They're really good, they can help you reanimate. Unfortunately not quite high enough in order to reanimate your Supayas, but you know, beggars can't be choosers. But something else that can help reanimate more undead for you to use in battle, as well as being a pretty potent cast themselves. It's nice to have. Another good use for your death gems is actually Spectres. Although you will be using your death gems mostly for Supayas, Spectres can break you into other paths you don't have access to, things like Glamour. And that can be really, really good for you as well. Having access to the additional paths, say like Glamour, say like Nature, can really improve the amount that you're able to buff your troops, gives you access to more forging opportunities, and even just get some gems for some additional empowerments, should you wish. And finally, we have Raven Feast. Depending on which summon you really want to go for, if you want to go for more Condors or if you want to go for more Supayas, Raven Feast can be a really great spell for you to use after a massive battle in order to get a whole boatload of death gems. Really good for summoning your Supayas, good for summoning up some extra Mound Fiends or Spectres, or whatever you're really wanting to use those death gems for, some more Skull Staffs or big summons. Now on to forging. What's your national forging item for Middle Age Nazca? Well, you have the Huaca Headdress. What this does, it gives you a buff to leadership, both normal leadership, magical leadership, and undead leadership. Gives you a little bit of head protection. It is a crown, so it can be worn by your Malky as well, which is really nice. Gives you inspirational for some additional morale, and gives you a summon bonus to your Supaya and to your Huaca. You get 1 extra for the reanimation action that you can do, and 2 extra for the magical summon. So keep that in mind when you're forging these headdresses, that they will help you quite a bit. And for 10 fire gems, they're not the most expensive, but they aren't the most cheap either. So forging, what are some good items for you to look for forging? Well, as always, you've got your research boosters. As Middle Age Nazca, you can make owl quills fairly easily. You have the air mages for that. You can make some hammers as well in order to make that a little bit cheaper, which is great. Getting that down to 3 air gems a piece, really good. Get some site searching down. You can make one of those every turn just to improve up your already pretty decent researchers in your Atlas. Later on, you'll also have access to lightless lanterns, which will also improve your research speed, really kind of boost you up once you get construction 7. Depending on how the rest of the game's going, that can be a massive boost for you for your late game ability to do some damage. For your boosters, you've obviously got your access to things like your skull staff, your skulls of fire, even your flaming helmets, which can't be worn by your Malky, which is unfortunate because they're not a crown, but, you know, beggars can't be choosers, or something like your coin of meteoric iron, in order to boost up all your various magic paths. You really want to be focusing more on accessories rather than anything else, because that's what your Malky have access to, so you'll be able to use them for all of your commanders. Can be really, really nice to use. And managing to get up even just one additional path outside of battle means you're going to get up 2 as soon as you cast something like Power of the Spheres inside the battle. Really nice to get a lot of these boosters. As I was kind of mentioning with the Wind of Death in the magic section, Ring of Returnings on your Royal Malky, which are going in to cast Wind of Death over and 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 over again on the enemy. Really nice to get. You can also use a Ritual, which they're both quite expensive, 15 Astral Gems for Ring of Returning. At least you only have to do it the once, and hopefully you're hoping that your Royal Malky is going to last more than once. Would be nice, but something to keep in mind. If you are going to be going down the corpse construct method, getting a Storm Spool is really good. Storm Spool is more important than any other item for you because it's a miscellaneous slot rather than a holding slot, so you don't have to rely on copper arms for that for your Malkys. Just saying. Also, if you are using a lot of air magic, you can get your Bag of Winds. Really nice because it gives you a temporary air gem every battle and gives you an air elemental. Nice to have, say if you're very worried about assassins, but usually assassins will struggle against Malky, so they'll not usually come against you. For a little bit more of an odd one, I've also included the Bane Venom Charm in here because of the Reaper ability. You might be wondering why, and it's because you have access to Flying Scouts. Flying Scouts plus a lot of death magic means that having Bane Venom Charms on a bunch of scouts to go around causing a whole bunch of disease to enemies' provinces, pretty nice to have. And hopefully you'll give it to one of their commanders and they won't even notice, and they'll start diseasing themselves if they're found. Always nice to do. But it's a very good idea, especially if you know where their research is, or if they've got a really good province, a high population. Slap one of these on, send a scout in, hopefully you won't get found. Because if somebody does find that your Bane Venom Charming a very good province of theirs, they're not going to be happy with you. Next up we have Spell Focus. Spell Focus is a really good one because of the magical penetration. If you can get the Spell Focus, or if you get your national hero and you get some Rune Smashers to improve your magic penetration, really, really helps when it comes to casting things like your Winds of Death. Any spell that relies on overcoming the enemy magic resistance suddenly becomes so much better. So, something to keep an eye out. Armor of Knights is included here because although it is very expensive, it's a very nice thugging item. Quite late in the game in terms of construction in order to get it. But if you do want to be using some of your commanders as some light level thugs, say if you want to equip some Apoos up with some basic gear, Armor of Knights is pretty cheap. It will massively increase the protection as well. So something to keep in mind. As I was kind of mentioning before in the communion section, using Sky Metal Matrixes, both the Sky Metal Matrix and the Slave Matrix, in order to improve your communions can be a godsend, especially on a lot of your commanders who don't have access to Astral. This will mean that you're then able to join communions with casters that are not normally able to, using some of your cheap Aklas, for example, as slaves, although they will have more fatigue than, say, some other people, just because they only have fire and air as their paths. Just make sure that you start to build these with hammers just so you can save 2 gems a pop. That'll be pretty good. And finally, for the last forging kind of thing that we're going to be going over is the Copper Arm. Again, construction 7, so slightly late, quite expensive to make, but what it does do is allows you to use some of those additional miscellaneous slots as arms for your Malky. All of a sudden you get 2 of these, which is quite expensive even with hammers, but that lets them hold a Skull Staff to boost up their death even more, makes them much better at casting the various spells they want to cast. Something to keep in mind, it's also very good for out of battle rituals and forging, although you probably want to be concentrating more on using your living people, as they can more easily use boosters than your Malky. Just something to keep in mind. Okay, let's move over to Pretender design for Middle Age Nazca. When it comes to Middle Age Nazca, they've got a selection of a couple of immobiles, not many titans, a couple of expanded pretenders, and some basic rainbows. They're using more of the Mayan culture group, which isn't the most populated in terms of pretender choice, so you're operating with not that much choice. You still got Earth Serpent though, so nothing to worry about there. Can always rely on Nice Wee Snake. It does mean that your pretender is going to be a little bit harder to choose from. Additionally, you don't have access to that many changes for your scales, the main one being something like the Fountain of Blood for additional magic scales. When it comes to whether or not you want your god awake, dormant, or imprisoned, you can have some issues depending on map generation for expansion, although that's not something you can get around by just having a whole bunch of slaves or a bunch of flyer guys and attack rear. But if you are against something like a whole bunch of problems with heavy cavalry, if you're completely surrounded by that, if you're surrounded by, say, like barbarians, then you might want an awake expander, but it's hard to know that before. As always, having an awake expander will make your earlier expansion easier, which means you have more money for more snowballing later. But if you're wanting to play more around your sacreds, if you're wanting to play more around your Condor spam, or if you want to get a lot of very good Supayas, then you'll probably want to get a more dormant pretender with a little bit better scale or bless. Speaking of scales, when it comes to Dominion for Nazca, I quite like to get like a 5 or 6. You're not too reliant when it comes to your recruitable sacreds, and they are only capital only sacreds, so you don't really need anything more than this. This lets you get a mage, and it also lets you get a whole bunch of sacreds, 5 sacreds a turn. That's pretty decent in terms of sacred production in my mind. Any more than this, it's starting to feel a little bit wasteful because you're probably starting to run into a bit more recruitment problems, and you're probably not worrying too much about your spreading of your Dominion because you have access to quite a lot of Holy Threes and some pretty good priests other than your Malkys as well. For your Order or your Turmoil, generally for Nazca you get a +1 to Order, which is nice, but going down to Turmoil 1 I think is probably okay. You don't need that many recruitment points. The Unrest reduction doesn't matter because you're not really using much Blood Slaves, and also most of your troops are flying, as well as pretty much all your summons are flying. So you're going to be absolutely fine for patrolling. You're going to have skeletons for chaff, you're going to have slaves for chaff if you don't have skeletons. You can have low upkeep or no upkeep patrollers, so that's not going to matter that much. Reduction in resources does hurt a little bit, but you're not really using that many resources as well. For production or sloth, I actually say just go sloth. Sloth 2 is fine in my estimation. It does ruin your income a little bit, does reduce the resources quite a lot. Your troops aren't that resource intensive, with the exception of, say, like your Sun Guards. They're probably the most resource intensive unit out of all of them, so if you are wanting to play more around them, maybe go a little bit less into your Turmoil and your Sloth. If you're wanting to focus more on using things like your slaves and your summons and getting these worse scales, it's absolutely fine. As for cold, I think going cold 2 is absolutely fine as well. You want things to be colder than hotter. Your Malky have really bad fire resistance, so you don't want things hotter so they're taking more fire damage. And having cold 2 will mean that you are dipping down to cold 3 in the winter, you're dipping up to cold 1 in the summer. It's not too bad, and you're better able to deal with cold damage due to the fact that most of your troops have cold resistance, so you're taking less fatigue. Now, as for growth or death, I would actually say going death is completely fine. Death 1 or death 2, depending on the level of whatever bless that you need. I think that's absolutely okay. Death 1 would be preferable, but death 2 is fine for the additional points. You're not collecting blood slaves, you're maybe collecting slaves, but you don't really have to worry so much about population for that. Overall, death isn't going to hurt. You're going to hurt your income over a long period of time, but that's where your heretics can come in. If you have a really high death, and it is destroying a really profitable province, just come in with your heretic, get rid of your Dominion, and suddenly this horrible turmoil you have, the sloth that you have, the additional cold, the death that you have, you can just wipe it out. That's great. All of a sudden, all of the negatives of your Dominion are just gone. That's the main use for your foreign recruit mages, if you want to use them that way. If you have good scales, maybe keep them away from your good forts, but, you know, you do you. Next up for Fortune and Misfortune, I quite like Fortune. Both of your heroes are quite nice. Getting additional luck is pretty good. You've got some Fortune Tellers with your Malky for getting rid of bad events. You could dip down into Misfortune if you wanted to. I don't like the combination of Misfortune and Turmoil. That just feels like there's going to be a whole bunch of really bad events all the time. I would say probably go more into luck. Luck 1's okay, or depending on whether or not you want to go for specific bless, going higher into luck is also fine. For magic or drain, I would actually say getting at least magic 1 is a very good idea. You've got a fairly cheap, fairly good researcher who is sacred, so you're not spending that much gold on them. Magic will massively increase the amount that they can research, will also even make your foreign recruit mages a little bit better at research. Still not great, but not terrible. You can go magic 2, even better. Just bear in mind that with magic 2, with your national spell for the geoglyphs, this will push you up to magic 4. That's then going to start causing bad things for the province, but it's a waste province, so you probably don't really care about that, and you'll want to just have as much research points as you can out of that. But overall, I think magic 2, absolutely fine. When it comes to blesses for Middle Age Nazca, we'll start with the basics. Strength of the earth as well as the blood version, strength of the flesh, absolutely fantastic for your sacreds. Your Condor warriors love it with their lances, your Condors like it. In fact, pretty much all your sacreds just like it. Having more strength, so they do more damage, especially on the charge, means they're more likely going to be able to kill the enemy, and strength of flesh is a great way to do it. It also combos especially well with Blood Surge. Blood Surge, as soon as they kill something, they get additional attack, additional strength, and defense, and obviously the reinvigoration. It really helps your ability to stay in combat for longer, especially when it comes to the reinvigoration, getting rid of that larger encumbrance that you have on your flyers. Additionally, I will keep going on about this until it is nerfed. Enchanted Blood on top of Undying is another really good combo for you. Maybe not so great for your Supayas, but the fact that you can get the Undying on your Condors and your Condor warriors really improves their staying power, and they'll be able to regenerate up after the battle and keep themselves alive. Additionally, +1 magic resistance for all your mages, pretty nice as well. I mentioned it earlier when I was speaking about the Condors, but I'll say it again. Obfuscate is a really nice bless for you to get as Middle Age Nazca. It makes all of your sacred stealthy. That means that you can now start to lead out your sacred Condors with some of your sacred priests. They can bless them, they can fly around, they can really start to raid. Having such great stealthy raiders is going to really annoy your opponent as well. Something to keep in mind. And it's not that expensive a bless. It's only Glamour 6. It could be worse, certainly. It does also have the knock-on effect of making your Royal Malky stealthy. Suddenly you have cloud trapezing, very scary casters that are also stealthy, able to get anywhere in the magic phase, stealth on out the next turn. Your opponent's going to have a real struggle dealing with that. As another bless I think is really good, Stygian Flesh is actually really good for you. Your units don't really have good natural protection, so the 10 invulnerability is quite nice. You don't really want to get Barkskin, because while it does give you natural protection, it's alright for your sacreds. You already have really poor fire resistance on your Malky. Giving an additional -5, that's -15 fire resistance. I really don't like that. That means they're probably going to die to any kind of fire spell. They don't have that much health to begin with, so, you know, I would say stay away from that. And also you have the advantage, the Stygian Flesh, and I'm not sure it's supposed to work this way, because Stygian Rain doesn't trigger on spirit form creatures, but Stygian Flesh does work with your Supayas. So basically means you have 10 invulnerability against mundane weapons, which, on top of their ethereal, does make them surprisingly tanky. Another one that I really quite like in terms of your blesses is Twist Fate. And that's mostly because of your Supayas again, but also due to your casters. I'll go on to that in a little bit. When it comes to Twisting Fate for your Supayas, they're already ethereal, which means that 3 out of 4 mundane attacks are going to miss. For the first one that does go through, and it does hit, the Twist Fate will just negate it. That's really nice. That means that you're going to be able to dodge many more hits. You're probably going to dodge up to something like 5 or 7 of them with your ethereal guys before they start getting hit. It means they're going to be able to clear out a lot of the enemy troops. Something that you quite like. For your casters, it means the first successful hit is going to be negated. That can really help when it comes to your scripts. They're not getting interrupted when they're casting something important. I've been using it quite a lot in a lot of my single player games, and I'm actually really quite liking Twist Fate as a bless. It does require obviously a bless, so you don't have it turn 1 in case there's a really quick spell that comes out. But if you get it off, if you get the bless off, it does really improve the staying power of your troops. We mentioned it earlier, but I mentioned it again. Piercing the enemy magic resistance is really nice for your Royal Malky when they start to cast things like Winds of Death. Getting additional penetration is really nice. It means that you're not relying so much on their miscellaneous slots, which depending on what you're wanting to kit them out on, could be a little bit full. and also means that you're not getting something like Fool's Luck like you would with the spell Penetrator. As for another bless, I do actually quite like quickness. Quicken units obviously move and attack twice as fast. They get +2 to their attack and defense skill, more likely to hit on the lance strike. And not only that, but there's some weird things that I've been finding with my testing where on quite a few occasions my lancers will be flying down and they'll be trying to attack someone. The other person will get the strike first and they'll die. With quickness or swiftness for this matter, that does seem to improve their combat speed enough that they are, I would say, probably 8 out of 10 times rather than maybe like 5 they're getting the first strike. Suddenly a big game changer, especially for your Condors. With a +2 to their attack, they're also much more likely to get that first to actually hit. And then they've also got 2 attacks per turn. This quickness buff is also disgusting on your Condors. All of a sudden, you've got 6 attacks per Condor, or 12 per square. Because you get 2 Condors to a square. That's horrible. They just chew through people with a quickness bless. You don't really have any way of casting it, normally, with the exception of your national hero, so you'd be relying on your pretender in order to do that. So, yeah, quickness, I quite like. Very expensive, difficult to get. Doesn't mean you're going to be sacrificing on other parts of your bless. I still really like it. When it comes to sort of a more basic bless, something like attack skill is really nice for your sacred troops. Just improving their attack skill, making them more likely they're going to get that first strike, really helps them out when it comes to killing the enemy forces. And additionally, it makes pretty much all your sacreds better. Your Condors better, your Supayas better, your Hoakas better. Everything's pretty good. Can't go wrong with attack skill, and it's pretty cheap if you've got some extra points available to use it. One that I've been kind of toying with is Inspirational Presence. It does give you an additional inspirational, gives you +50 leadership. I was trying to use it out with a couple of my Royal Malki so that we had big armies of humans, undisciplined humans, that they had pretty decent morale. They are getting the inspirational at least, so they are getting a big bunch of morale boosts. And especially that's actually quite useful for your non-mindless undead. So, you know, your mileage may vary. I'd say give it a try if you want to, but I've tried it. I'm on the fence about it. I think there's better things you can do for your bless points. As far for blesses to stay away from, I'm probably going to say Fear is one to stay away from. Fear is still really good. I do really like it. I think it's very useful on a lot of your sacreds, and you will have quite a few sacreds, so Fear can be useful in that respect. But all your sacreds are size 4, so you're not going to have many of them to a square, and you're going to have less of a Fear, or it's harder to get really that sort of like Fear bless rolling. You don't really have any mounts, you're not getting the double Fear from that as well. It's not as good as it is on other nations, so I'd say stay away from it. I'd also say stay away from Etherealness. Very expensive. Does require 2 magic, which you kind of want to go for. But one of your sacreds already has it. It's a lot of bless points to go for something that one of your sacreds already has and only slightly improves survivability for others. I would say stay away from it. Go for something cheaper like Twist Fate or Fate Weaving or something like that, rather than going for that. I'd also say stay away from magic weapons. A lot of your sacreds already have magic weapons, and the ones that don't, you're not really wanting them to go for thugs or buffed up troops. And by the time that big army-wide spells come out, I don't really think you're going to be using your sacreds that much for actual damage dealers. It's probably going to be more your Royal Malki. As mentioned before, Barkskin, one to stay away from because that really screws over your Royal Malki. You don't really want to have that additional fire weakness on them. It doesn't give that much natural protection. I think Stygian Flesh is better. Obviously not against your non-magical weapons, but if you're really worried about it, you could go hard skin just for that little bit of natural protection, or just cast some defensive spells on your mages. Berserker, another horrible one for you. You have a lot of sacred mages, just I wouldn't bother with it. It just means that if you have a Royal Malki go Berserk and you lose them, that's a big blow. Just don't go for it, I would say. Leave it to other nations to go for it. You're absolutely fine. Regeneration's a waste. You don't have that high HP that is actually useful. It doesn't work on your undead. I'd say stay away from it. Reforming Flesh you could potentially go for, but again, you just don't really have the HP on a lot of your sacreds. It's not that useful for your living sacreds. I'd say just stay away from it. Okay, with that, let's go through some example pretenders that you can go for Middle Age Nazca. As always, these pretenders are just my opinions. You can go with whatever you want, but I found these pretenders to work okay, and they give you a couple of examples of the different ways you can play the nation. So first one that we have I Ain't No One's Mummy, the immortal Koya who is awake. She starts off with Air 4, Earth 4, Astral 6, Death 5, and Nature 3, with a 5 dominion, 1 turmoil, 2 sloth, 3 cold, 3 death, 1 fortune, and 1 magic dominion, with the strength of the earth, arcane finesse, twist fate, and Stygian flesh bless. The idea behind this Koya is that she's able to come out early, she's awake, she's immortal with only 1 month immortality, so you can use her to try and expand, you can use her to try and research early. She can just help you out from the beginning of the game. She's got quite a nice bless with Twist Fate and Stygian Flesh to help you out early with your expansion with your Condor Warriors that you're going to be using to help out, and with a little bit of Strength Earth as well, with an Arcane Finesse for some later on work too. You really want to be using this lady for her immortality. She can be really useful in your first war. She's a pretty powerful spellcaster. She can get some good spells out, especially if you're able to research up with her quite quickly, if you're not needing to use her for expansion, for example. Get high research, get a lot of evocation for your first war, have her blast around the place, spamming out a whole bunch of air spells, for example. Maybe even getting some nice personal mist forms, getting her out, gear her up a little bit, can be quite useful. And use her with your sacreds for some fairly early war in order to try and snowball off that. Her scales aren't the great, she has a pretty high death. You will start to feel that certainly in some of your provinces, and the cold 3 as well means that more people are going to die over the winter, so you do want to be taking as much of your provinces as you can. For your more populous provinces, use some of your heretics to get rid of some of that cold and some of that death. That's probably a good way of preserving your population. Next up we have the I absolutely love Condors, the Apu Ilpa. He is dormant. He has 10 air and 5 death, with a 6 dominion, 0 order, 2 sloth, 2 cold, 2 death, 1 fortune, and 2 magic dominion, with a thunder weapons, undying, and Stygian flesh bless. The idea behind this guy is pretty much as the name says. He is here to summon Condors. He will summon an absolute boatload of Condors every single turn once he's no longer dormant. I mean, that's like, what, 17, 18 Condors every single time you cast? The guy's just great. When he comes up, you'll be wanting to use a lot of your sacreds that you're kind of keeping in reserve, because you'll be able to get the thunder weapons, which is really nice for just making them do just a little bit of extra damage with their attacks. Also goes really well with your Condors. And then also gives them Stygian Flesh for just a little bit of invulnerability against mundane weapons. A little bit more of a one-trick pony. He's not that useful. He is a Titan, so at least he can help a little bit if you give him some gear. He's got a lightning attack, just base, that uses a bit of fatigue. He's got his Thunder Fist, crown. Hasn't really got that great in terms of basic equipment, but he does come with 2 air elementals, so he can be quite useful. Cloud Trapeze him all over the place. He does have storm power, so cast some storms once you get it, and he can help out in combat just a little bit. And then he's obviously got the thunder weapons that go along with that too. But yeah, main aim of the game with this guy: summon Condors, keep summoning Condors, drown the enemy in Condors. That's basically your entire game plan. Next up, we have the Sprinter Supaya Supreme, the Oracle, who is dormant, who has 9 water, 6 astral, and 5 glamour, with a 7 dominion, 1 turmoil, 2 sloth, 2 cold, 2 death, 1 fortune, and 2 magic dominion, with a defense skill, quickness, and twist fate bless. The whole idea behind this Oracle is she is here to buff up your Supayas. She's going to be sitting there, she's going to be getting you a whole bunch of quickness when she comes out of her dormant state, getting your twist fate for your mages and for your Supayas to keep them going, and a little bit of defense skill just as a little bit of an extra one. You could potentially go for a chill aura bless if you wanted to. You do have the cold resistant on all of your units, so you're a bit more resistant to that, and it can be quite fun if you do that with a cold 3 dominion. Otherwise, just go with the quickness one. Additionally, the Oracle also has access to both Glamour and Astral. Glamour you don't usually have, so that's really nice. You've got high Astral when it comes to a little bit of forging, certainly for some of those miscellaneous items. And then you also have the option of using Project Self for an additional innate caster. Can't cast anything with gems, unfortunately, but it's quite nice to have her there if you wanted to cast some water spells. Just having the Oracle there, just casting a whole bunch of, say, Gift of Formlessness or something like that on your Condors or your Condor Warriors can really help them out in combat too. Otherwise, the Oracle can just sit at your house, research away, and worst comes to worst, if you really need your Oracle in a battle, teleport them in there, full complement of gems, and they'll absolutely wreck shop with your Malkies. Finally, last but not least, we have Imprisoned Rainbow number 1.6 million, the Frost Father, who is an imprisoned pretender with 4 fire, 5 air, 4 water, 4 earth, 4 astral, 4 death, 4 nature, 4 glamour, and 4 blood, with a 6 Dominion, 1 Turmoil, 2 Sloth, 2 Cold, 2 Death, 1 Fortune, and 2 Magic Dominion. And for his Bless, he's got 2 Attack Skill, 2 Strength of the Earth, Arcane Finesse, 4 Undying, 2 Strength of the Flesh, Enchanted Blood, and Blood Surge. The entire idea behind this guy is he gives you not terrible scales, but not great, certainly some good magic ones, and gives you a lot of really nice magic variety come the late game. He is imprisoned, that does suck a little bit, it's going to be a long time before he comes out, but his Bless is still quite useful until then. 2 additional attack skill for your Sacreds. You've got +4 strength, so the Condor Warrior is actually doing a whole bunch of damage on that first land strike, really good for dealing with their commanders. You've got a combination of the 4 Undying and the Enchanted Blood in order to keep them alive a little bit more. You've got the Blood Surge for a bit of reinvigoration, really nice as well on your mages if they kill something. A little bit of reinvigoration, and also the stats on your basic Sacreds as well, really nice. And then for your mages, you've all got Arcane Finesse to help you a little bit more in the late game. Main idea with this guy is to be imprisoned for the most part, but once he comes out, he can do a lot of things for you. You can do a lot of forging, you can do a lot of site searching if you really need to find some additional gems. Just be a little bit careful about using him in combat. He isn't the tankiest, and he doesn't have invulnerability like the Koya, so you have to be a little bit more wary about using him. Worst comes to worst, when he does come out, you can always use him to summon some more Condors. He's got pretty decent air. It's the best out of all of his paths at level 5, so you're able to get a bunch more Condors every single time you summon. Otherwise, if you prefer to go for a bit of a less of a Bless and more of a Dormant Pretender, you can also change this up. As always, it's a rainbow. Do whatever you like with him. And with that, that's our national overview for Middle Age Nazca. Thank you for watching, and hopefully you've enjoyed it. And maybe you can finally show the land of the living why being ruled by the dead doesn't suck that much. I want to say thank you very much to all the members of the Burger Band for supporting the channel and myself. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do that either through joining the YouTube community and becoming one of the Burger Band, or through Patreon, or alternatively for coffee, if you'd like, just help out a little bit. Any and all help is appreciated, and really means the world to me. But not as much as you watching this video, so thank you very much for watching. I hope you're having a really good Christmas. Until next time, take care. We wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Glad tidings we bring from this burger who sings. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.